Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. This is our third and final lesson on the introduction to the Epistle of Hebrews. Today's session will focus on the audience of Hebrews and probable dates of when it might have been written. Recall from our last session that scholars suggest this is actually a sermon given to an audience rather than an epistle, or that is, rather than a letter. Some claim it is early theology in what becomes the Christian faith, particularly in its debate with Judaism. Much of that faith was still well connected to Judaism early on, and the local synagogues, especially through the 30s and 40s, but changed fairly rapidly, as percentage-wise anyway, as the Gentiles began to join in more and more mass with Paul's movement. We must appreciate that the word Christian or Christianity and Gentiles does not appear in Hebrews. And for that reason, there are many scholars and probably a growing body of scholarship that's pointing in a direction that this is actually a debate, although maybe given to a non-Jewish audience. It's a debate primarily with early Christianity and Judaism. Some claim it is that since there isn't this appearance in there, that in fact we have to keep in mind there's not the words Christian and Christianity only appear 3 times in the New Testament at all, twice in Acts and once in Peter, and in each of those it is referring more or less to a group that does not acknowledge the Roman emperor as God. And so those are 2 things that the scholars keep bringing up as we begin to think of audience and think of dating that have something that may be at play here. The Jews did not either worship the Roman emperor as God, but there's a big difference. They had an exemption, an official exemption that had been established for that faith early on in the Roman rule. But Christianity, or Christians leaving the synagogue especially, did not have such protection. Many scholars suggest that that is that protection rule for Judaism, kept the new faith close to the mother faith probably longer than it would have otherwise. However, there was pressure mounting on Jews in some of the diaspora areas to unify their faith, more consolidate their faith, become loose enough that some were thinking that's why Romans are giving them a hard time. And so there was an attempt to consolidate the faith somewhat. And at this point in time, there was more pressure put on maybe non-mainline groups, might be a better way to say, of which Christianity would have been one. Several scholars suggest that this sermon may well have been used for an audience in such a situation that was concerned with its protection. Those of the new belief, that is what later becomes known as Christianity, but is in fact accepted the beliefs of Christianity even at that time, are being forced to choose either a new faith by identity or to the old. And some are electing to abandon the faith of what we call Christianity, built around, that is, this faith built around that Jesus was the Messiah and that there's only one God, the same God that the Hebrews worship. And therefore, that issue of the Roman emperor is playing a bigger and bigger debate in scholarly research in the last 20 years. Dr. Fred Craddock says that the Greek word normally translated church throughout the New Testament only appears twice in Hebrews. He and others suggest this may point towards a very loose congregation at best, that is, congregation relative to Christians or this particular group that they're delivering this to. But they appear to be, in his thinking, a Christian congregation contemplating leaving the base of Judaism. And the writer then is issuing very strong warnings against that to these people in this book of Hebrews. Excuse me. Some have acknowledged the faith, however, in this congregation and received the blessing of salvation. We don't know how many, but it clearly implies there are some. So they are warned very strongly that should they leave that thinking, that belief, they are in danger of serious issues relative to their faith, relative to their salvation. So who is this audience? The bottom line is the manuscript does not reveal it. So let's leave it there and concentrate on maybe some inferences that scholars are providing to give us some idea of who are the type people that the Hebrews has been written to. The oldest surviving manuscript of Hebrews is from the 3rd century, and it's been dated to somewhere around 240 AD. It is on papyrus, and on the cover of it, written in a different script, is the Greek words translated to the Hebrews. There is no direct statement within the text itself to support that this audience is Hebrew, or even to support that title. If in fact it is a title, and there are many people who argue that it's not necessarily a title, particularly not the title given by the author. They believe the author did not title it. Scholars suggest the audience is most likely of a faith that later is called Christians, although they're not called that, or at least this person doesn't acknowledge them, and it was sometime much later before they actually carried the identity of Christians, which we see in Acts, which was written late. They are aware of the threat of persecution and that it is building towards them, and depend on when and where this might be happening and who these people are, whether they're Christians or whether they're Jews, has a lot to do with how we interpret things. Because both of these groups, both the Jews and the Christians, not so much the Jews at this point, but the Christians or what we call Christians, are being persecuted. And of course, the main persecution that occurs to the Jews occurs after they rebel in 68 AD. And the primary reason that they're being persecuted is this issue that is now germane in the Roman, especially in the Roman, main Roman province, rather than the outlying province, is this worship of Caesar as God. The majority opinion suggests that they are likely Jewish Christians, but some people argue that this is a Hebrew or Jewish community who are still associated with the temple and are contemplating, if they're Christian Jews, contemplating a return to Judaism, most likely over the issue of safety. This author seems to know his audience and appears to have been with them at some point, and he hopes to return. Such language is very typical of Paul, as we know, and therefore there's a strong argument that this is one of Paul's churches. If it's not written by Paul, they kind of have given up on that debate, but they still think this may be one of Paul's churches, or a church that has, you might say, spun off from one of Paul's, or by one of Paul's associates. Their faith seems to be weak, however, and many scholars suggest they are either maintaining elements of animal sacrifice or returning to it, or considering returning to it, because a big part of Hebrews deals with Christ as the perfect sacrifice for human sin. Thus, they do not seem to understand, that is, this audience does not seem to understand or have firmly fixed that Jesus' death and resurrection has earned them salvation and that nothing else is needed. Salvation is or the covering of human sin, it seems to be a big issue for them. Thus, the author concentrates in Hebrews a large part of his discussion centered on what the Day of Atonement and the events that happened on the Day of Atonement in Judaism, as that seems to be the debate that he is excuse me, centering on. And therefore, we'll see more of this. There is just not enough in the Hebrew text to allow anything close to a sound conclusion relative to who these people were. We must also appreciate that there had been considerable Hellenization of the Jewish communities and their culture, and their faith was practiced in the diaspora area especially, was modified very much differently than what was being practiced in Judea. That had been going on for 400 years before Jesus, and particularly before, if we say this is written in the 1st century AD. Thus, some argue it is not necessarily a return to Judaism that is involved here, but would argue it could equally be a return to the pagan religions. In more recent scholarship, a school of argument has emerged that there is a group of Hellenized Jewish Christians in Rome at or near the time of Nero's reign, and that they may very well be the audience. There is evidence in history that Nero was receiving strong advice from throughout his kingdom to remove the Jewish exemption and to persecute Christian movement. The Roman emperor was to be worshipped as God, period, was the requirement, especially in Rome proper, that is the province of Rome. Nero's rule from 54 to 68 AD. Dating of this sermon has gained much support for that time frame, that this is during Nero's reign, and the dates of 64, 65 now seem to have a large majority of the later scholarship surrounding that date. The famous fire that occurred during Nero's reign was in July of 64 AD, and the Christians were in part blamed for that fire. Nero's persecution was not confined, however, just to that event or that immediate time period, but covered a much longer period of time, especially later in his reign. Hebrews mention of remembering hostility, that is, remembering the hostility towards these people, they say, though, is most likely not the remembrance of the fire. In other words, this is prior to the fire type event, but instead is the Claudius time frame. And those who think this is a Jewish audience are especially firm on that idea. Claudius was the emperor immediately before Nero, and he expelled the Jews and Jewish Christians from Rome proper to the outlying provinces. They were allowed to return, however, early on in Nero's reign, and there was not a lot of killing of people at that time. There may have been some, but the martyrdom is not the issue. It's just general persecution. That is, we can't worship what we want to believe or what we believe. We are being restricted by government rules. That is, this involvement of church and state in religion. So that the exiled generation, since it's been allowed to return, would have been very much aware of what Claudius is doing, because based on these dates and times, many of those people would still have been alive. And so that may very well be, many scholars say, the people that Hebrews writer is referring to. It is the persecution event that scholars have focused on in dating Hebrews more than probably any other thing. There is now general agreement with a time frame of 60 to 65 AD. That seems to be where the most general feelings and support are at. But there's still disagreement. Some, as not many, past 90, and some even earlier. Mainly because there was stronger persecution of the Christian component during the 60s to 65 period, with the Jewish component persecuted more a little earlier and much later. Not too much later, 5 years later. Just a few years later, however, the Jews in Judea rebelled against Rome, and the Roman army destroys the Second Temple in 70 AD. And that rebellion started in 68. And the result of that rebellion and the wars that proceeded, that followed, the destruction of the foundation of Judaism as it was practiced or known in those days occurred. And what emerged after that is rabbinic Judaism, based on the local rabbis' teachings, rather than a priest and temple concept as previous to 70 AD. Since Hebrews is silent about that event of the destruction of the Second Temple, Dr. Peter O'Brien and others argue powerfully that this is just too significant to the author's main argument not to have been mentioned if it had happened. So much of Hebrew text is built around the temple and the trappings of it with the Jewish faith, so that he's contrasting what they believe in Judaism with Christ and what Christ is, especially relative to the sacrifice. Hebrews argues that Jesus Christ was an acceptable blood sacrifice, worthy of being offered for human sin, because he was the high priest, rather than someone in Judea in the temple. Would not have made, and so this argument that the Hebrews writer is making would essentially make no sense if the temple was no longer there. It's the main argument that most people now go into. Hebrews author uses the temple in Jerusalem as his model to direct his audience towards a new line of thinking. Other scholars still argue that the audience is not in Rome because it was the Eastern Church that we learned here in our first lesson that supported and preserved the Hebrews as a letter. And they fought for it to be canon. And they fought for it to be understood to be authored by Paul. However, most of that literature is aimed really by the Eastern Church and its support of Paul more than anything else. That is, the support of Paul as the author of Hebrews. And that idea has pretty well been rejected by modern scholarship. So it's possible that this audience was one of the Eastern churches, but there's just not evidence to support that. The fact that Gentiles, Gentiles, Christians, and Christianity are not mentioned. There is a still a very strong school of thought that this is being presented to a Jewish or even maybe to a synagogue rather than to a Christian Jewish audience. However, if that be the case, buried in that Jewish audience is also what we would call Christian Jews, that is, people who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Because this author clearly makes that very clear, that those who have already accepted that belief are placing their salvation in serious jeopardy if they abandon that thought. Next week, we will move directly to the text of Hebrews and follow our tradition of reading and discussing chapter by chapter. Hopefully these introductory sessions will help prepare us to better understand this book, because Dr. Fred Craddock warns us right at the beginning, says this is the most difficult study in the New Testament. So I hope you have a good week, and next week we hope to enter directly into the text of chapter 1.